My name is Petra Tschakert. I'm a geographer by training, and I'm based in central Pennsylvania with a fairly large university called the Pennsylvania State University, and I work there in between the Department of Geography and the Earth and Environmental Systems Institute. We're here in this fabulous place called Aberdour, which happens to be located in between Edinburgh and Dundee in Scotland. And we're here for a 3-day workshop with a bunch of practitioners and academics who are all interested in a knowledge network, an international knowledge network that looks at practices and processes for enabling transformation. I got involved in KNET, this network interested in sharing knowledge about enabling transformation, almost a year and a half ago. There was a workshop in Oslo, Norway, and it was the first international workshop, or conference I should say, on transformation. And several people who are here today, who are part of this network, were also present at this first international workshop. And we formed some immediate, instantaneous alliances, people who are similarly minded, who are interested in understanding what enables deliberate societal transformation. And I think that's a really relevant question for several of us, independent of the geographic, cultural context we come from. And that was the starting point. My particular interest was to involve partners from developing countries, particularly a partner I've been working with for several years, 6 years, whose name is Modok from Ghana, and I'm very happy to see him here today among 20 other people who have come from a variety of, well, countries and continents, as a matter of fact, to think about practices that may be inspiring, that may be powerful, that all allow us to better understand how transformation actually happens. In the context of climate change and vulnerability, I think transformation is a really useful concept because it allows us to understand interconnections, interconnectedness. I think we understand climate change as a tremendous environmental challenge that we all have to take seriously. But I think what is even more important is the social challenge that comes in a rapidly changing world. I think my particular interest is in the way we as humans are interconnected. I'm interested in understanding how we in a very affluent northern world are interconnected to people who are not as privileged, not as advantaged, who do face scarcity, who do face poverty. I'm interested in understanding how we are indeed connected, and I'm interested in further stressing that there are interdependencies between all human beings, as well as between human beings and non-human beings, nature. And I think this is something that a transformative lens allows us to stress, maybe in a more direct way than a resilience lens. I think resilience is useful, of course, to understand coupled, complex social ecological systems. We understand they're connected. We understand there are feedback processes between the two, but there's no normative agenda that is implicit in the resilience framework. Nobody tells us what we ought to do, what responsibilities we have towards other parts of the system. And I think the transformation lens, especially one that looks at deliberate transformation, allows us to understand what responsibilities are embedded when we think about interconnections and interdependencies. I see that quite a lot in my own work on climate change adaptation in a development context. And I think looking at transformation allows us to understand that we want to appreciate and respect the other, whoever the other is. That could be people in developing countries, in the global south, people who are poor, who are disadvantaged. But it also could be people who are part of the next generation, who are not yet born, and yet we have responsibilities to the next generation as well. And of course, I think it's worth stressing that we have responsibilities to non-human actors, the environment, nature. And I think that that particular focus on responsibility and care and a commitment to protect those who are more vulnerable is something transformation allows us to highlight and to stress. I think another component that is particularly interesting to me from a transformational lens is the concept of shared or mutual fragility or vulnerability. What I see happening in the climate change context is that we as scientists have a tendency to define vulnerability, to try to bring order into different levels of vulnerability by creating vulnerability indices and vulnerability maps. And we constantly map the other as being highly vulnerable, while overlooking that we are also vulnerable. So I think a transformational lens allows us to see that we are equally, maybe not equally, maybe I take that back, but mutually vulnerable and fragile. And there's wonderful work that comes out of critical social science that allows us to see the relational aspects between people and non-human actors, to understand that vulnerability doesn't have to be something that is intrinsically negative. Right now, we understand vulnerability as a lack, as a deficit, as something that needs to be overcome. While at the same time, we can think about vulnerability as something that is between you and me, something that is relational. And we can only be vulnerable if we're allowed to admit ourselves that we also can experience harm and that we also can be affected. But with the experience of harm and affectedness comes the ability to be open, to be receptive, and to love and to care for each other. So I think being part of a network that looks at practices and processes that enable transformation allows us to understand relational aspects rather than looking at dichotomies. The poor here and the rich there, the vulnerable over there and the not so vulnerable here. I think it's intriguing to think about how we influence and shape each other and how my doing and my way of living influences your being and your way of living, and vice versa. I think there's a lot of room to explore this relationality, that interconnectedness, and I find really that this is something that is not present neither in the literature today on climate change adaptation or vulnerability, nor in the literature on resilience. So it's a particularly, I think, empowering angle that certainly is influenced by, thinkers in feminist epistemologies who look at the ways we are connected and related. And to me, this is highly fascinating. I've started working on vulnerability and then transitioned into adaptive capacity, and now I'm grappling with the concept of transformation. So it is an evolution over time. And I think it has been a useful evolution. I think I've learned quite a bit and stretched myself quite a bit, because vulnerability was certainly a framework that dominated the climate change agenda 10 years ago. I haven't counted for I don't know, a couple of weeks now, but if you just Google vulnerability assessments, you will find 10,000 of vulnerability assessments. And at a certain point, I think we all have to ask ourselves, what do these assessments tell us? What's the story we get out of them? And the story, surprisingly enough, is almost identical from one assessment to the other. The story describes a particular group of people, usually the poor, the disadvantaged, or a particular sector, water sector, or a particular country as the most vulnerable. And there is, as a matter of fact, I think, a pervasive race to the bottom. Every place, every country wants to be the most vulnerable because it may facilitate funding for adaptation. So I think this entire discourse and debate on vulnerability has become quite crippling. It cannot be that we advance our well-being by sharing how vulnerable we are and how extremely vulnerable we are. And I think it's crippling for many communities. I work in rural areas in Ghana, in Tanzania, in northeastern India, in Nepal. It's not empowering to know that your vulnerability index is 7.6. That's not helpful. So I've shifted from work on vulnerability assessments to work on adaptive capacity. What is it that allows people to manage changes they experience in their environment, whether that's erosion or the fact that climate change has brought rainfalls that are more and more erratic? I'm interested what capacities already exist, primarily at the community level, again, rural communities, poor, disadvantaged communities. And what is it that people have managed to observe themselves? And what is it that people think about the future? I've been fortunate to lead a project on anticipatory learning for climate change, adaptation, and resilience that looks at adaptive capacities, but it adds the particular angle on anticipatory capacities. How can we possibly foresee what changes may occur in the future? And it's a little tricky because on the one hand, we of course are interested in facilitating and enhancing this adaptive and anticipatory capacity, but at the same time, we cannot predict the future. So the trick is to create enough space that community members who are not part of the mainstream climate change discourse, who may not even be aware that emissions from the global north can affect rainfall patterns in West Africa. So it's a space that allows people to envision the future and think what changes could happen or are likely to happen, and then prepare for a whole, we call it envelope, of possible futures. That allows people to embrace uncertainty that is, of course, involved every time we think about the future in a more proactive and hopeful way. I think a lot of times people are afraid of the future in the sense that they can't predict it, it's out of their control. But by using very creative and participatory methods that allow people to envision the future, we have used participatory scenario building, we have used theater, we have used all kinds of mapping and drawings and discussions that allow people to have a stake in their own future and to delineate what they think is worth protecting, what they can protect themselves, what trade-offs they would like to make between current generations, future generations, their own community, neighboring communities. These trade-offs need to be discussed. There need to be a space to discuss what people find important in their lives. And that's related to values, that's related to worldviews. And many of the adaptation projects that we see getting funded around the world don't take into account what matters to people, what they find worth protecting. So creating these spaces through a variety of methods by simply envisioning the future and allowing people to say, that's an interesting possibility for the future. What is it we need to do today to move in this direction? Or the opposite case, identifying areas that could be harmful for people, for the environment, and to decide today, what is it we need to do to prevent getting down that slippery slope? I work in areas where governmental assistance in terms of adaptation funding is essentially non-existent. So what is it we as researchers can do? That's what motivates me, to work with people and say, let's look into the future, let's decide what we can do today and where the limits of our adaptation potential is. I think it's really important to stress that not everybody will be able to adapt himself or herself out of the climate crisis. I think we'll encounter more and more limits to adaptation. And I think it's important to realize where these limits are at the community level, and then to say, what contacts can we establish with the partners we work with in the field to go and address repeatedly the next higher administrative unit, the district office, the regional office, to say, look, we have thought about adaptation. Look, we have made an adaptive plan. We have a management plan. This and this and this can we do, but here are the limits. Please assist us in very specific dimensions. To me, this is exciting, right? Because it allows us to focus on potential. It allows us to focus on capacity building rather than just infrastructure. Building a dam here, invest in drought-resistant crops. The next step, of course, is transformation. And what's appealing here is that we understand, coming back to the limit of adaptation, that even though we need adaptation, there's no doubt, at the community level, internationally, as well as we need mitigation. But I think we have come to realize that neither of the two, not even together, will be sufficient to allow us to address the climate crisis. So my hope in the concept of transformation is that it will enable us to reflect on the way we interact with each other, the ways we value each other, recognize the other, and say the way we do that today is absolutely unacceptable. And I've just recently prepared a paper, document that looks at interactions between poor and rich people in a variety of contexts. One that comes out of France just before Christmas, which I find just absolutely disturbing and unacceptable. And here's the story. So it was in the newspapers, it was on the internet. Just before Christmas, France experienced a cold spell. So it was getting really cold, nothing unusual. What was unusual was that certain authorities implemented iron fences around benches in parks, benches in front of major shopping areas that the more affluent citizens wanted to use for their romantic, pristine Christmas encounters, Christmas shopping. So the fact to include the poor and everybody else who may be considered unworthy, including the homeless people, from the landscape, from the cityscape, is an example of an interaction between those who are more affluent, more powerful, and those who are less. That is absolutely unacceptable. Another case I've read recently that shows a similar pattern of what we just call relational poverty. The poverty of one person or one group shapes the luxury and the privilege of others. Another story comes from Nigeria. Very recent work on climate change adaptation in Lagos. Major metropolitan area. I don't know how many million people live in Lagos now, but clearly there are neighborhoods that are privileged and many, many more neighborhoods that are very crowded, overcrowded, with number of slums and homeless people. So the example that comes from this particular climate change story is that members of a particular class, the lower class, the underclass, particularly women, explain their distress in the context of flooding. So every time there's a major rainfall event, in addition to sea level rise, these particular women from poor neighborhoods, from slums, are particularly affected on many levels. They fear that their children will drown in canals that are just full of garbage. But what's really disturbing is that women shared with the research team that when they're pregnant, or if they're pregnant, and they want to seek medical assistance with the local clinic, they have to bring their husband to the clinic, and the husband has to donate blood. Now, the husband is not donating blood for his wife who is pregnant and may encounter some medical difficulties. No, the husband is obligated to donate blood if he wants his wife to be treated for a blood bank that is made available for the more affluent, the more powerful, the richer people in Lagos who seek private treatment at private clinics for cancer treatment, or you have it. So this imposition of a health policy that affects the already disadvantaged even more, literally giving the poor, giving blood for the richer, is absolutely disturbing. Right? So this is something that I hope a lens on transformation, deliberate transformation that focuses on interactions between people, can address and say there must be a different way to deal with poverty, with homeless people, with disadvantage, as a concept that is relational rather than exclusionary, rather than excluding or labeling the poor as a social category apart. So this is a long, long explanation from having started with vulnerability assessments, to enhancing adaptive capacities, to addressing inequalities that have been growing and growing and growing in dimensions that are really frightening. And I think this is the next enormous challenge that I think we as a global society face today. And I think some of this work has been tackled, addressed, explored in the most recent IPCC report, and I think it's going in the right direction. Why has it taken so long to address something that seems so clear and self-evident? This is a question that we geographers ask ourselves quite a bit, and there is, in fact, discussion among geographers who have been looking at human-environment interactions for decades, who, of course, say vulnerability doesn't fall from the sky. It's not something that is emerging now. It's something that we as human environment, political geographers have been investigating for quite some time. And we understand that vulnerability is intimately linked to structural inequalities in society, to uneven development processes. We know all that. So that's absolutely not new. What is interesting and what is new, I think, but which may also be frustrating for people who have worked on that topic for so long, is that it has taken the climate change community, the scientific community, quite some time to really embrace the social sciences and to embrace human dimensions that may not be that easy to monitor and to measure. It's really not that difficult, even though I cannot claim I've ever tried it, but it doesn't seem to me very difficult to measure ice cores. You can quantify, you can create, of course, change matrices over time. It's much more difficult to measure inequality, to measure adaptive capacities, to measure vulnerability, other than just imposing an index or a color on the map. So we understand that it is fluffier, not that straightforward. And I think within the climate change community, it has taken some time to acknowledge that certain dynamics cannot be, at least not right now, cannot be quantified. So there is a lot of qualitative knowledge out there that we only now start to value and validate and say, this is important. We may not be able to put a number on it. We may not be able to predict whether or not there was a 10-degree or a 10% change, but we know it's happening. So I think this is a kind of natural evolution within, for example, the IPCC to incorporate social sciences, an insight that is empirical, that is theoretical, that needs to be triangulated, that is rich and descriptive, but not necessarily quantifiable. So I think this is one reason why it has taken us so long, at least from a scientific perspective, to understand dimensions like intersectionality, the intersecting dimensions of disadvantage along dimensions of gender, race, age, class, and so on. There are, and it's true, there are very, very few studies that look at climate change from an angle of intersectionality. You know, we have had an enormous mushrooming of literature on gender and climate change, how women and men are differently affected. That's all good. We need that. But there are very few studies, especially in the global north, that look at how race and age, for example, influence adaptive potentials. Right? We don't have that material. I think it's only now slowly emerging. I think another reason why it has been really difficult to address the obvious inequality and the inequality gap that is growing and growing is that within the political domain of climate change, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, there's a lot of debate on the financial implications of understanding gaps in adaptive capacities, in vulnerabilities. There's a lot of debate around the notion of historic responsibility. Do richer countries, industrialized countries, more affluent, more developed countries, indeed have a financial obligation to compensate countries who have not produced the emissions that cause the degree of warming we see today? Is there an obligation or not? And one of the reasons why Copenhagen in 2009, the Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen in 2009, was just so absolutely demoralizing was that at that time historic responsibility was just brushed off the table. I think now this question is coming back, and it's under the notion of loss and damage. Loss and damage are not the same as adaptation. I think the world, countries, parties of the convention realize that there has to be money available for adaptation, much more than we see in today's pots, right? There's something called the Adaptation Fund, there's something called the New Climate Fund. The estimates around how much money is needed for adaptation vary, fair enough, but they range between 75 and 200, 300 billion a year, every year until 2050. What we have on the table now, committed, are 30 million. That's peanuts for what is needed, but that's adaptation. Loss and damage is outside of adaptation. Loss and damage is money that would allow communities to deal with the losses they encounter from sea level rise, from extreme events, and that's a lot of money. I was at a meeting in Lima in Peru called a Structured Expert Dialogue between IPCC authors and delegations, country delegations, to discuss the adequacy of the 2-degree target as a long-term goal to prevent to prevent damage, to prevent harm. So is 2 degrees indeed the right target? Is this the threshold for danger? We of course understand that 2 degrees is an average, right? It's a global target. And we understand that already communities today experience more than 2 degrees. So 2 degrees target would be by 2100. Already now we have communities, countries, regions that experience 2, 2.5, 3, and 4. So is that target adequate? No. What would be a more appropriate target? Well, many countries, especially the small island states, they argue 1.5 would be a much better target, even though there are also losses involved in 1.5. There's no doubt. Now, are we going to reach the 2 degree target? Many people believe no. I think we're already on a pathway that exceeds 2 degrees. Now, why would certain countries push for 1.5 target if we are unlikely to reach 2 degrees? It seems to be just a waste of time to even argue about that. Well, it's not a waste of time because countries realize quite well that as soon as we exceed a 1.5 degree target, again, global average, again, realizing that there will be large variations, but as soon as we exceed that target, loss and damage will have to kick in a way that no country in the global north is prepared to pay today. So there are enormous financial implications of addressing poverty, inequality, exclusion, vulnerability, differential vulnerability in a way that the North is not prepared to pay for. Is there any way to democratically address inequalities and vulnerabilities in our societies, especially in our societies in the North, more affluent societies? I think there is. I think one of the first hurdles that would need to be overcome is the hurdle of discourse. I think the way we frame poverty in affluent countries is very much around the notion of individual failure. So somebody is poor is blamed for being lazy, not motivated enough, for having had difficulties in overcoming personal disasters or natural disasters, or maybe even genetic reasons, right? It's that portrayal of poor people as an individual failure. And I think we have to overcome that discourse. I think we have to overcome it. I see it particularly strong in the US. This is where I live. This is where I'm most exposed to discourses of poverty. You know, think about places like Seattle, for example. Seattle comes across as a really progressive place, and yet inequality and poverty are rampant, and the number of homeless people are really high. But the framing of poverty around this individual failure, I think, prevents us from connecting with the other. So I think a change in discourse is one thing, and part of what I do as a teacher and as an instructor at Penn State University is to bring in notions of relational poverty, of responsibility towards the other. And in my context, it's primarily between a US setting and Africa, right? Bringing up examples of how we are actually connected. So one of my most favorite activities in class is to ask students where the ingredients of their cell phones come from. I still don't have a cell phone, I resist, but of course every student has a cell phone. Well, it turns out that most of the ingredients, the heat-resistant materials, come from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And students don't know that. Nobody on the street would know that. But as soon as students understand that their lives are in fact connected to the lives of people who mine for cassiterite and coltan in the eastern part of DRC under unhuman conditions, then all of a sudden it clicks and students say, hang on a second, we are responsible. We're responsible for recycling our cell phones. So I think these small activities to point out, to stress, to uncover that we are in fact connected along multiple lines and levels, that helps. There's a wonderful example that actually comes out of the US, and I learned about it fairly recently at a conference on relational poverty. There's something called intentional neighbors. So these are people, middle-class people, often motivated through a religious background, who move deliberately, on purpose, into low-income neighborhoods and try to be intentional neighbors. Not to preach how the others should lead a better life, but to collectively, together, attempt to rejuvenate dilapidated infrastructure, like a community library, like a park. So I think there are encouraging examples that show us that we can connect in a more responsible way, that we can overcome these really, really damaging and crippling discourses that pursue dichotomies, we here, they there. I think this is the way to dismantle some of these dichotomies and say, we are connected. One of the maybe not so ethically and not so desirable occasions are disasters, right? We have seen across the world, whether that's Katrina or Sandy, Superstorm Sandy in the US, or flooding in Pakistan, earthquakes in New Zealand, flooding in Mumbai, India, that disasters very often bring out generosity and hospitality and support and solidarity. And I think there are lessons to learn from these disasters. I'm not saying we should create disasters to create spaces for solidarity and generosity, but all of a sudden, people actually experienced that they too were affected, or their neighbor was, and maybe they were just lucky not to be affected. So this is the moment where mutual fragility becomes most palpable. And I think these are the lessons we have learned so far to do better and overcome these inequalities.